It's very, very difficult to come up with one streamlined history of DC Comics, but Mark Waid is trying to do that, and I personally think they made a massive mistake. Superman's arrival on Earth is no longer the catalyst for the age of heroes in the DC Comics universe. That is basically set in stone now with the new history of the DC universe. Kind of surprising that Mark Waid decided to go this route. I would have imagined that he would have spotlighted the character or made him more than just a footnote in the opening salvo of the new history of the DC universe. I'm not here to review the entire comic book. That would almost be impossible. I'm just here to talk about the major changes to DC's continuity and the way, certainly, that Superman was treated dirty. Thankfully, not every comic book writer wants to go back in the past and kind of erase history and transform the way we think about Superman and other things happen in the DC universe. There are writers out there celebrating the awesome history of characters like John Carter and certainly awesome creators like Edgar Rice Burroughs. Now let me take a quick moment to spotlight a new indie comic that's doing something very, very cool. It's called the Mars Chronicle #1, and it's a raw, uncensored adaptation of Edgar Rice Burroughs' A Princess of Mars. This is old school sci-fi pulp brought to life with action, adventure, and yes, blood and nudity, just like the original novel intended. It's all laid out in stunning magazine-sized pages with art from Adriano Batista, who's worked on Red Sonja and Jungle Girl. And this is just the beginning. The goal is to adapt the entire Barsoom saga in comic form. Issue #1 introduces us to John Carter, a Civil War vet who ends up on Mars and right in the middle of a brutal alien world. It's perfect for readers tired of mainstream junk and hungry for classic, high-stakes storytelling. It's live now on Crowdfunder, and you don't even need an account to back it. Just click the link in the description or pinned comment to check out the campaign, view some killer interior art, and grab a copy. Support an up-and-coming creator doing it right. That's the Mars Chronicles #1, pulp sci-fi done the way comics should be. DC Comics and Mark Waid want to pretend that Superman is no longer the alpha, the beginning of the age of heroes in DC Comics. That's fine. But if you want a reminder of what real myth-making looks like and what happens when creators celebrate classic heroism rather than gutting it, you need to see what the Mars Chronicle is doing with the Princess of Mars. DC Comics just dropped a continuity bomb in New History of the DC Universe #1, and Superman takes the hit. The Man of Steel, long seen as the figure who launched the Age of Heroes in 1938, is now barely a footnote. He's mentioned exactly once in the entire issue, tucked into a single panel of Barry Allen's massive timeline. Instead of inspiring an era, Superman's arrival is treated as an afterthought, just one more costume figure in a world already full of them. Heroes like the Justice Society, Dr. Occult, and even Milestone's Icon are shown operating well before Kal-El's rocket touched down. It's a drastic rewrite that strips Superman of the defining role as Earth's first public superhero, reducing him to one player among many. For longtime fans, it's more than a retcon, it's a demotion. And it definitely reads that way when you grab the comic book. You're expecting Superman to be front and center. He is the alpha of the DC superhero universe. And he's really not in there. There's a picture of his cape when you see Wally's office, and then he's mentioned on the very last page. But even then, the destruction of Krypton is kind of downplayed in the significance of DC Comics history. And I think this is a major folly on the part of not only DC Comics, but Mark Waid, not realizing that the arrival of Superman, no matter when it happens, ushers in the Age of Heroes in DC Comics. This has been established many times by different writers over the years, and it always ends up coming back to Superman. Every time DC decides to go back, retcon its history, maybe downplay the significance of Superman and his arrival on Earth, ushering in this age of superheroes that we're all still enjoying, it always gets flushed down the toilet. Everyone forgets about it, or they just ignore it completely. The most recent example I can think of, do you remember that Scott Snyder wrote a Wonder Woman story that basically portrayed her as the very first superhero in the DC Comics universe? It was either in the Wonder Woman 80th anniversary special or the Wonder Woman 800 issue. Scott Snyder wrote that story establishing that Wonder Woman was the first hero before Superman. Everyone forgot it because Superman is that important, not only to DC Comics, but just to the history of comic books and superheroes themselves. He is the icon of all superhero icons when it comes to comic books. And to downplay the role that Superman plays in here and showing that there have been costume superheroes long before him and people were always aware of them and superheroes were just always there, definitely felt like a Marvel Comics Avengers 1 million BC type of idea. And you end up kind of demoting the character in the end because you start taking them down off that pedestal that everyone basically holds them on. This was a major folly on the part of Mark Waid and DC Comics, and I'm actually pretty surprised he did it because, by all accounts, he's an enormous Superman fan. And forget everything you thought you knew about the modern DC timeline. According to this new canon, it didn't start with Superman's arrival. Instead, it kicks off with 3 simultaneous events: Krypton's explosion, Martian Manhunter's accidental teleportation to Earth, and the birth of the government-run Supermen Project. That last one replaces the Manhattan Project in this timeline, with scientists like Niles Calder, Will Magnus, Martin Stein, and Simon Stagg engineering metahumans as part of a Cold War arms race. This reframe doesn't just downplay Superman's significance, it casts a long shadow over dozens of heroes. Firestorm, Metamorpho, and others may no longer be heroic accidents, but government experiments. It's a cynical twist, rewriting DC's mid-century legacy as a story of state-run superhero manufacturing. This is not the first time we've ever heard about the Supermen Project. It was certainly brought up during Doomsday Clock, where Geoff Johns was incorporating the Watchmen universe into DC Comics, and you had Dr. Manhattan basically screwing with everything. And part of that screwing with the timeline ends up being the Supermen Project replacing the Manhattan Project. Even before it was finished, it was removed from continuity. So clearly they are re-adding the inclusion of the Watchmen universe, Doomsday Clock, into DC continuity. We'll see how that plays out in the next few issues. But what's really interesting, despite that kind of cynical view that a lot of heroes and villains, their genesis or origin is no longer tied to events that happen. It's things that are made to happen by state governments, as they're in this metahuman arms race that starts, obviously, in the next issue. But what's really interesting about Doomsday Clock is if you go read that from Geoff Johns, the clear central focus and point of the entire book is that Superman is the alpha. Dr. Manhattan starts screwing with the timeline and starts removing Superman's arrival, pushing it back 20 years, pushing it forward 10 years. And no matter what Dr. Manhattan does, Superman's arrival, whether it's in 1905 or 1985, is always the moment that the Age of Heroes arrives in the DC universe. No matter how Dr. Manhattan shifted that stuff, Superman's arrival always ushered that in. And I think they kind of missed the point on that. And I will be very interested to see what other parts or ideas in Doomsday Clock, which is a very ambitious comic book that I'm an enormous supporter of, gets thrown in there and what they decide is going to be part of canon, because it does start erasing history. The JSA and a lot of those superhero teams are erased from history during Doomsday Clock, but now they're there. So obviously they're taking liberties with what was established in there. And I definitely think we're going to see a new version of that with the inclusion of the Watchmen universe also in the DC Comics, because they already started that. New history doesn't just rewrite DC's core, it absorbs entire universes. Milestone Comics' Icon is now part of the main timeline, shown arriving on Earth in 1839, predating Superman by a century. The implication is clear. Milestone's world is now DC canon. The same goes for the Sandman mythos, with the endless light, dream, and death woven directly into cosmic history. Add in the medieval era Demon Knights and the World War II era All-Star Squadron, and you've got a single timeline stretching from myth to modern day. It's ambitious but messy. With so many timelines stacked together, it raises obvious questions. Why didn't someone like Icon change history more? Why did the world still need Superman? Folding everything into Earth Prime sounds inclusive, but it also muddies the waters. And DC Comics have tried this idea a lot. So the most notable example I can think of is the inclusion of the Wildstorm universe. Obviously, the Image Comics imprint that Jim Lee started back in the day. And when Jim Lee was brought on board at DC Comics to be an executive and creator there, the acquisition of Wildstorm was an enormous part of that. And they've been trying to incorporate the Wildstorm universe into DC Comics for a very long time. Now, even before the Wildstorm universe had arrived, DC had already made up knockoff versions of their authority with the Elite and things of that nature. There are certainly a lot of DC analogs in that Wildstorm universe. And once you start dealing with these copies of copies, trying to force them into the DC universe just doesn't work, because you already have more established versions of that character in that universe that people like. People go to DC Comics for Superman. They don't go to DC Comics for Icon. people go to DC Comics for Batman. They don't necessarily go to DC Comics for hardware, unfortunately, and those are knockoff type of characters. There's really only one unique character in the Milestone universe to fold into DC. And when I say unique, he would be unique to the DC universe, but certainly not to comic books in general. And that would be Static, who is definitely a Spider-Man analog. But they've tried that already, and it's already failed several times. So every time they try to force another universe that they've acquired in there, it normally doesn't work. Even the Charleston stuff, they've been able to pick and choose a few characters here and there, and certainly we all love Blue Beetle, and I like the Question and all that stuff, but they're not exactly mainstays in DC Comics, and it's very difficult to find their spotlight in there because there are so many previously established DC heroes, and a lot of them do have overlap. The inclusion of the Sandman universe is a little bit more interesting. Certainly it plays into the more cosmic aspects, the mystical aspects of the DC universe, and it's done perfectly fine there. I'm a little surprised they're doing it with all the issues that Neil Gaiman's going through, but they've certainly flirted, not only with Milestone, but definitely with the Sandman universe, of incorporating those ideas or those concepts of those characters into the Prime universe. We've certainly seen John Constantine with Endless and stuff like that in the past. We've seen some of the Sandman universe characters certainly crossing over with characters like Swamp Thing and everything like that. They are now fully fitted into the DC Comics universe. I think it probably works better with the Sandman characters because they are a little bit more unique and provide something a little bit different than the Milestone universe, which are basically just superheroes and analogs at that of characters that have already existed and already been very, very successful a lot of times at DC Comics itself. The biggest rewrite might be cosmic. New History pulls together DC's entire divine and multiversal architecture into a single mythology, from the Source and Perpetua to the Monitor, Anti-Monitor, World Forger, and the Sandman's Endless. Everyone's now part of one grand origin story. Even Darkseid's backstory gets rewritten. He didn't rise from the ashes of the old gods. He was granted godhood directly by the Source. That's a major shift in the fourth world mythos. Instead of fighting for power, Darkseid was literally chosen. This isn't just synergy in the DC universe, it's consolidation. Kirby's Fourth World, Gaiman's Vertigo lore, and DC's Crisis events are now tightly fused. For lore hounds, that's either thrilling or sacrilegious. Either way, DC just wrote the creation myth of its entire universe, and it definitely starts at the very beginning with the Source Wall being basically an analog to the Big Bang, and the arrival of these kind of gods, checks and balances, players for good and evil, some people kind of being in the gray areas of all those things, and that's certainly where the Sandman universe stuff was weaved into, and adding all these elements that we've seen and all the crisis events kind of to the beginning of time. I don't know if that works. When you start going back and looking at the New 52 after Flashpoint, it's kind of hard to stitch that together with a post-crisis universe. It's also hard to stitch together events like Flashpoint, which certainly happened, but now it's in one singular time frame. Where the reason Flashpoint exists and the reason that the universe changes is because he literally goes outside of time and starts changing history. And the history from the point of the New 52 starting is completely different than the history that precedes it. You cannot stitch that stuff together coherently. It doesn't make a lick of sense. So in many ways, I do think they're trying to fix a problem that cannot be fixed. I think you probably just need to live with the universe as it is, warts and all. And if the fans are okay realizing that from this point to this point is a certain era of DC Comics, and it's a little bit different from this point to this point, and these crises events are really bookmarks of beginnings and ends of universes and the way timelines are working, and people have certainly accepted that. We've been doing crisis events since 1985, I believe. I don't think it's really even worth the effort because you're just going to screw all this stuff up, or somebody else is going to come in after Mark Waid and change everything, which is exactly what happens and has happened time and time again in the last 40 years since the history of the DC universe. As far as a comic book, like I said, I'm not going to review it. It is a comic book. It has pictures with words that go along with it, but there's no central protagonist or anything. You have a narrator, and he's just going through the timeline. I found it particularly boring. Not exactly a fun read. The art's pretty good in most of the spots, but it does get a little wonky here and there. There are a ton of fucking Easter eggs. You know, they're incorporating like even all the like DC Wild West fucking characters before Superman existed in this goddamn universe. Mark Waid clearly did a ton of research, a lot of work went into this to add all this stuff to one streamlined timeline, if you can even call it that. And there's a lot of characters I didn't even know existed. So in that part, it's kind of fun and interesting, but there's not really a story there. It's just chronologically, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. And I find it kind of boring. I would have just taken whatever the series is going to be in the end. Is it 4 issues? And I would have released it as a trade. And I don't think this is for every DC fan that wants a superhero story. I think this is for the very hardcore DC fans that want an understanding of what this new timeline is. But I truly believe that 90% of DC readers or comic readers in general could really just give a flying fuck about all that, to be completely honest. And before we go, I do want to mention again, if you're tired of watching the big two destroy all their icons, and how could you not be at this point, the Mars Chronicles is going to be a breath of fresh air. Link in the video description. Definitely go back that on Crowdfunder right now. If you appreciate what we're doing here on Think Critical YouTube, and you'd like to support the mission, providing the news, reviews, awesome coverage of comic books every single day right here on YouTube, but also on Patreon in the form of podcasts, that is the place to be. You support us there, you find the right tier for you, you get awesome podcasts in return, and we get to keep moving forward, providing stellar coverage of the comic book industry every single day.